Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar on addressing learning gaps due to COVID-19. I'm Asad Islam, Director of the Center for Developing Economics and Sustainability at Monash Business School. This webinar is hosted by the CDS in collaboration with BRAC Institute of Governance and Development in Bangladesh. This is a part of our ongoing series, COVID-19 and Beyond, to cover a wide range of topics related to the ramification and response to the pandemic. So before we start, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which our four Australian campuses stand and pay our respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. So the pandemic is causing huge disruption to education. Schools in many countries have been closed. Since March last year, children have lost more than a year of schooling now, and many children may not return to school. So last year, when the schools were closed, suddenly teachers in many countries could move abruptly to distance learning. However, online learning is out of question in many settings, particularly in developing countries. World Bank estimates suggest that millions of children will drop out of school because of this pandemic. So what might be the long-run consequences for children and the economy as a whole? Well, we know that schooling raises skills, and at the national level, lower aggregate skills means the lower aggregate growth rate. So the pandemic will have a long-run effect, not only affecting the educational achievements, but also lowering the wages and also probability of getting employment. So what can be done? What are the potential policy solutions? Can large-scale assessments of educational systems shed some lights on how to address this crisis? It is inevitable that more resources are needed to address this problem. At the same time, we also observe that budget cut, particularly developed countries are cutting the foreign aid to developing countries and NGOs providing these vital services, including education. So immediate policy responses are needed to reduce and reverse this inequality due to COVID-19. So aside from some hue and cry over university and college examinations, there has been little conversation for support to be extended to the millions of children who have been pushed out of the education process during this pandemic. Reopening schools when the cases are low is simply not enough, given how the dropout rate is going to be. What efforts are being made to re-engage the students who probably have permanently left schools? So our speakers will address these issues, the learning loss, the interventions, and the measures to be taken. We are very much delighted to have three distinguished speakers, and I will introduce them by alphabetical order. So our first speaker is, in terms of the alphabetical order, is Rukmini Banerjee. Rukmini is now the CEO of Pratham, one of the largest NGO in India, working on education for the underprivileged children. She has extensive experience in design and delivery of education interventions and has played key roles in developing and implementing Pratham's partnership with governments. Over the years, Rukmini has led assessment activities of Pratham, including setting up an internal measurement, monitoring, and evaluation unit. She was also the director of the Asher Center, which is Pratham's Autonomous Research and Assessment Unit, conducting the nationwide survey on education. Rukmini has been with Pratham since 1996, and in 2015 she took over charge as a CEO of the Pratham. She is an economist, a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and has PhD from Chicago. Our next speaker is Professor Kartik Muralidharan. Kartik is currently now the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at UC San Diego. And he is a principal investigator on the RISE India team and co-chair of the Education Research Program at the JPAL at MIT. Karthik is probably the best known scholar on education, especially on economics of education in developing countries. His research has been published in leading economics journal and featured in global media outlets. Um, he has many notable contributions. The earliest contribution I can remember is the absenteeism of teachers and health workers in developing countries. He has conducted many large-scale experimental evaluations on a range of topics on education, including impact of performance-based teachers, impact of contract teachers, impact of cash grants to schools on learning outcomes in India. He is actively involved in policy advice and capacity building in India, both at the central and at the state level of government in India. And our third speaker is Mr. Asif Saleh. Asif is currently the executive director of BRAC in Bangladesh, the largest NGO in the world as well. He joined BRAC in 2011. He has been deeply anchored in driving the strategic direction of BRAC. And he also led the development of BRAC's 5-year strategic plan in 2016. But prior to joining BRAC, Asif worked as a policy specialist for the Access to Information program at the Prime Minister's office in Bangladesh. He has also spent 12 years in Goldman Sachs in New York and London, ending his term there as an executive director. And he is also an active member in a range of international networks and alliances, advocating sustainable development goals achievement. He is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, a member of the Millions Learning International Advisory Group at Brookings Institute. He is also a member of the South Africa-based Innovation Edge promoting early childhood education. And he holds an MBA degree from Stern School of Business, New York University. So before I pass the baton to our speakers, for the audiences, we have a Q&A session after our speakers give their deliberation. So please post your questions in the Q&A function at the Zoom at any time during these proceedings. Without further ado, I would like now to invite Professor Karthik Muralidharan to speak.
Thank you, Asad. And thank you to the organizers for putting together this incredibly important topic for discussion. I requested to go first because in some ways I am the least useful today because the title is really what we should do to address the challenge. And as an academic who's not been in the field, unfortunately, for the past 15 months, I don't have that much to say about the practical aspects of what we should do. But what I do have is the research to highlight why this is probably the biggest slow burning crisis that we need to pay attention to. And, I think people are obviously focused on the immediate matters of oxygen and providing hospital supplies. But the slow burning crisis, in fact, there was an article that said that when we look back on this pandemic 10 years later, the single biggest crisis that we will remember that will last over a generation is the impact on schooling of tens of millions of children around the world. In fact, probably hundreds of millions if you look at across countries. So I think, so what I'm going to just start by just showing you is I think we all need to first recognize that even before COVID, there has been a learning crisis, even in the best of conditions, with schools running, with teachers appointed, with things running as well as possible. We were in a situation where first generation learners in particular were falling substantially behind the curriculum. And so one of the reasons why a lot of input-based interventions were typically not translating into better learning is that children fall so far behind the curriculum so fast that you typically don't make progress when you're sitting in a classroom and the curriculum is already way too advanced. So I'm going to share one particular slide, just one it's one picture, and many of you have probably seen this if you've heard my talks before. But I consider this one of the most important pictures to understand developing country education. It's from India, but I have strong reason to believe that the pattern is very, very similar, at least in other sub-Saharan African countries, and likely in many other developing countries as well. So So what is this data showing us? It's basically from a study on computer-aided learning, which allows us to finally calibrate learning levels of students. And if you look at this picture, hang on, let me just project this. Yeah, so if you look at this picture on the left, what this is showing you, this is from a sample of about close to 5 to 7,000 children across rural Rajasthan. And the x-axis is basically the class, the grade in which the student is enrolled in. Okay, so this is integrated schools all the way from class 1 to class 8. Okay, the y-axis shows you what is the assessed ability learning level of the student. So now these are government schools. And if the children were in fact making progress as per the curricular standard, you should expect everybody would be on this 45-degree line, which is the blue line over here. Okay. But in practice, what you see is that the true learning level is closer to what you see on the red line, which is roughly half the rate of progress envisaged in the curriculum. Okay. And so this is what this is telling you, is that the average 8th standard student has a learning level of actually a 4th standard student. Okay, is 4 grade levels behind. And the way we're able to show this, conceptually for a long time, we've been wanting to plot these learning trajectories. But what makes it possible is because we have computer-aided assessment that allows us to dynamically vary the difficulty of the question. You can start children, say, at an 8th standard level if you're enrolled in 8th. And if they don't get it right, you can make it easier and easier till they get it right. So in some ways, the most stunning and important fact in this picture is how much variation there is within every grade level. So each dot in this picture represents 10 children, okay? And so what this picture is showing you is if I look at an 8th standard class, within that same classroom, I have some students at a 2nd grade level, some at a 3rd grade level, some at a 4th, some at a 5th, at a 6th, at a 7th, and an 8th. And a big part of this reflects the no detention policy that we put in place now, which was very well intentioned. It was well intentioned with the goal of preventing dropout, because it is certainly true that if you were to detain children for not meeting grade appropriate standards, the likelihood of dropout would go up. Okay, so it was very well intentioned, but kind of the unintended consequence of this is that because you have now pushed children through to higher grades, even without having mastered the basic competences, then you are in this situation where a 7th or 8th standard teacher has to deal with this practically humanly impossible task of simultaneously teaching students who are at a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. So, as a professor, if I was in a class, having to deal with that kind of variation, it would basically be impossible. Okay. So, which means what does the teacher do? What does the teacher do under normal circumstances? Is the teacher ends up focusing on completing the textbook and completing the portion. Okay. And so this is obviously stuff that Rukmini and Pratham in particular, and, Esther and Abhijit have shown this in multiple settings and multiple studies, focus more on primary school. But as you can see, the problem gets even worse as you go to middle school, because the variation gets even more unmanageable. And what does the teacher end up doing? The teacher defaults to saying, okay, I have a textbook, I have a portion, I need to complete this. And the reality then of the student experience is that you're so far behind that your best attempt at somehow surviving this exam is to cram every question you can, but hopefully, try to study every previous year's exam and somehow hope and pray that some subset of those questions will show up on the exam so that you can essentially spit out what you have learned by heart. Okay, so these tests are conceptual tests that are testing if you actually understand the concepts. And it highlights just the deep crisis that we have in the Indian education system right now. And, it's a good chance. I'm only going to show you one slide, right? And I'll keep coming back to this picture in terms of thinking about the implications of COVID, but since many of you have probably seen this picture for the first time, one natural question people have when I present this this graph is people in the US will often tell me, wait, I thought India had one of the best education systems in the world, right? Because India produces the CEO of Microsoft, the CEO of Google, the CEO of IBM, wherever you look, you see that Indians are doing so well. So we thought you would have a good education system. But the way to make sense of the Indian education system is that it is fundamentally not an education system, but what it is a filtration system. Okay, so what you have in the Indian system is exam after exam after exam, and the system is designed to identify who is smart. And if you are smart, right, you get channeled into institutions of high quality like the IITs and others, and eventually, the top of the distribution does fantastic things. But it's a mistake from there to somehow infer that the education system is doing a great job, because I think one of the deep challenges of designing education systems is you have two very, very different functions of an education system, right? There's what you can call the human development function, which is how do I take every child and make them learn more than what they had before, versus the sorting and screening function, which is how do I identify who is smart, okay? And so the entire Indian education system is really oriented around the exams and the sorting. So Devesh Kapoor and others have this very nice book on the Indian immigrant experience in the US, what they call the other 1%. And they basically make a very compelling argument that the reason the Indian diaspora in the US is so successful is basically a selection story, right? That you manage to select the right tail of the distribution of 1 billion people, and that right tail is going to do great things regardless of the quality of education they actually got, okay? Now, what is the importance of this in the COVID time is, and we were just discussing this before the webinar started, right? Is if you look at the amount of attention that we're paying to education, if at all, the main focus is still on, okay, are we running a 10th standard board exam? And why do we care about the board exam so much? Because the board exam is still, it's a measure of this signaling and sorting about what is, because you need to then determine who's getting into college and stuff like that. But there has been shockingly little kind of public attention discourse paid to this issue of what is happening to learning and what is happening inside schools or not inside schools, given that the schools are basically being shut down. And so it's almost like the issue of children's learning loss, except for maybe Rukmini and a few others like who've been talking about this, for the most part has just not occupied the kind of policy centrality that one would hope. And again, I don't think we can necessarily blame policymakers for this, because part of the issue is that people are also incredibly risk averse. And so, the parents are risk averse, policymakers are risk averse. And, you just tend to think, okay, let me stay at home. Let me just survive this year and let's not take a chance of sending the kid to school, because as long as they make it through without falling sick, maybe they can catch up later. But I think this also highlights the other really deep structural challenge of optimal policy in response to COVID, right? Which is that the optimal policy is going to be very different as a function of people's SES, right? So there is a health versus education trade-off when you think about, should I be opening schools and should I be sending kids to schools? Now, if you're high SES and if you have access to technology and have access to educated parents, the learning loss from being at home is perhaps not as much, and the health education trade-off may veer towards kind of staying at home, because the marginal benefit on education of going to school is not as high because you can do a fair bit at home. But on the other hand, if you don't have technology, if you don't have educated parents, then essentially the school is the only thing you have, in which case the optimal policy may be different. But that's a very, very difficult and nuanced message for policymakers to either internalize or to communicate. And so in settings of low state capacity like India, where we're not even able to do a calibrated lockdown and it became kind of all or nothing, trying to imagine nuance in the context of education policy has kind of, is perhaps a step too far. So let me just kind of quickly highlight some of the relevant research beyond kind of this picture, right? So there's a very important paper by Jishnu Das and co-authors using data from the earthquake in Pakistan in 2005. And this was in the context of a panel study they were doing in Pakistan, and they were able to look at households on either side of the fault line, where basically some houses got completely devastated by the earthquake and other houses just on the other side were somewhat unaffected. Now, what is really interesting about that study is this earthquake was a case where the foreign aid actually came relatively quickly, and the aid was very, it was distributed fast and the houses got rebuilt, okay? But what's interesting is 4 years later, when they go back and measure what's happening to the human development outcomes of the children who were young during the time of the earthquake, what they find is that even though the household assets are in fact doing better in the earthquake areas, right? Because essentially the places that got affected by the earthquake got the foreign aid to rebuild their houses. So the new houses were actually better than the people who were not affected by the earthquake, okay? But in terms of learning outcomes, what they found was that the children who had missed school for even a few months, that if you had an educated mother, then you had pretty much caught up. But if you didn't have an educated mother, the learning loss that happened from missing about 3 to 4 months of school during that earthquake was persistent 4 years later. Okay, and so that just gives you a sense of the magnitude of the crisis we are likely to have when these children come back to school. Because, in a 3 to 4 month earthquake, even after your assets were restored, that loss was not recovered. And think about how much worse things are during this pandemic, when not only have the schools being shut much longer, but household livelihoods have also been devastated in lower SES households. So that just gives you a sense of, how serious this problem is likely to be. There is a recent PNAS paper based on data in the Netherlands, right? Which again, the Netherlands was probably the best case you can imagine, because again, this is the lockdown was somewhat minor, and parents for the most part were educated and had access to technology. But even in the Netherlands, essentially school closures, the data shows that it led to if not learning loss, at least there was no learning gains in that period, even though there was an attempt to teach children remotely. And the data also clearly shows, even in the Netherlands, an increase in inequality as a result of the school closures. Okay, now these are again the best case scenarios. Now, in developing countries, actually right now, I'm not aware of high quality longitudinal data that allows us to quantify the learning loss at different parts of the distribution. In fact, we were going to do this in our own data in multiple studies in India, and we were going to go, because we had longitudinal panel data up to March last year, or maybe February, early March, and we were going to go back in March this year till the second wave hit. So we don't actually have data in a representative sample to show what's happening to learning at different parts of the distribution. But I think what the Pakistan earthquake results in the PNAS paper in the Netherlands suggest is that the learning loss is going to be very, very severe, and inequalities have almost certainly gone up. Okay, so now, so at one level, this is very, very, very grim. Okay, and I think the only thing I would say, to the extent that the goal of a forum like this is to get policymakers to start paying urgent attention to this. I think, in just speaking for India, the focus is still very much on oxygen and getting the medical supplies, which is important. But schools, I think people have almost written off this coming year of school, and assuming that schools will probably still be shut for the most part. Some states have said schools will not open in 2021, and I personally think that is kind of it's a big mistake. I don't think we should kind of blindly go and open schools, but I really think we need to have a plan that says that, we're going to prioritize vaccinating all teachers. We're going to think about, what do we know about the disease? We now know that this is primarily airborne. We know that ventilation really helps. We know that masking really helps. And, the good news is, at least in rural areas, the population density is low enough that you should be able to come up with prudent school reopening kind of processes where you meet outside, go back to the old style of kind of learning under a tree, take a blackboard outside if need to be socially distanced, but kind of work out a plan, have something so that that you're able to switch it on, as opposed to saying that we're just going to wait and somehow hope that this kind of pandemic is going to pass, because it's not going to pass. And in the past year, we should have learned that, we need to be able to, as a society, take calibrated risks in how we proceed. That, like not taking a decision is also taking a decision. So similarly, not opening schools is also taking a decision. It's just that you're not seeing those learning losses in front of you. And therefore, whereas if you were to open a school and there was to be a set of infections, and even, God forbid, one child were to die, that would be a media disaster. And so politicians and everybody is just being too risk averse to kind of, take those hard decisions. But, my personal view on this is, however difficult it may be, that if you're a general leading troops at the time of a war, or whatever decision you take, there are going to be casualties one way or the other. Sometimes they're seen, sometimes they're unseen. But as a leader, it is the leader's job to kind of aggregate the evidence, aggregate the science, consider the cost benefit, and be able to communicate to the population that we are taking a considered risk in doing this. Not make it mandatory, but kind of at least have an option whereby you can have socially distanced outdoor learning options for schools to open. Now, I think governments are trying a lot with technology. There's a lot of attempts with TV. There's a lot of attempts with smartphones. And I think this is all kind of very creditable. But, from the few states where I have seen what has been happening and where we have tried to do some measurement by calling households to see the extent to which these interventions are sticking, we don't have hard data on this, but basically my conjecture here is that a lot of the remote learning stuff probably has some impact, but is almost certainly less than what would happen with school. And even if it's happening, it's probably exacerbating the inequalities, right? So, we've now got multiple papers that show that the bureaucratic incentives and the political incentives are for the appearance of activity rather than the outcome of that activity. And if the appearance of activity here is, yes, I'm doing TV programming, yes, I'm doing some WhatsApp stuff, yes, I'm doing some smartphone-based stuff, but there is no actual data on how this is working. There's no actual data on the learning losses. And all of my kind of cumulative experience in the field suggests that we are almost certainly looking at kind of a looming learning disaster when children come back to school. Now, I think in the long term, I would say there are two potential silver linings. Okay, so there's one obvious crisis staring us in the face. The two possible silver linings in the long term is, one, this may accelerate the adoption of certain technology-based interventions. It may reduce kind of the hesitation of parents to do smartphone-based work or to have WhatsApp groups. And so to the extent that you can jump the hurdle in terms of technology adoption, we know that technology has the potential to be effective. And so that could be one possible source of long-term benefit. The other very interesting possible source of benefit is greater engagement of households and parents. Okay, so if you go look at the classic Coleman report in the US in the 1960s, the headline message was that 80% of the variation in learning outcomes for children can be explained by household factors. And so at one level, this is very depressing, right? Because as a policymaker, you think I can do something about schools, but I can't go change the household. And so to the extent that as a policymaker, you want to ensure universal quality education for everyone, it's a little depressing to think that you can only influence 20% of the total learning if 80% is in the household. Now, the good news in the last 6-8 years is with the spread of cell phones and mobile technology, we found and have lower cost ways of accessing the household and trying to intervene at the parental level, and minor interventions, text SMS-based interventions of getting parents to just check in on homework and do, small light touch interventions have been found to have a positive impact. So, one possible silver lining of all of this is that if the COVID crisis has taught us how to reach children through the household and has created a certain amount of increased engagement through the parents, there may be some possibility for that to stick even after the crisis. Okay, so, but again, I'm just trying to find some rays of optimism in what is otherwise a very bleak situation. And my main goal here is to just highlight and bring to policymakers' attention and saying that, listen, we can't sit this one out and just somehow assume that this pandemic is going to go away. We need to kind of get in front and center of this and start making plans that can be calibrated based on kind of, so that if the infection rate goes up above a certain amount, so that you have a very, very, very fine-tuned strategy that's constantly measuring the infection rates at the district level and being able to tune, just kind of calibrate your response as opposed to go completely 0-1 in that, all schools are shut and then one fine day I'm going to open them. So let me stop there and then I'll take more questions in the Q&A.
Thank you, Karthik, for very nice introduction of what's been happening in the learning level. Especially we have learned that the learning gap is increasing as the children are progressing in the higher grade, and also we have seen learned that actually this gap needs to be addressed and children needs to be probably taught at their level of learning. You have suggested some options for opening up schools and also potential solutions in terms of the tech-based education. So we will learn more from our other two speakers. So now I would like to introduce Rukmini Banerjee.
Thank you, Asad. And it's always good to go after Karthik. We've done this
Jugalbandi.
Exactly before. And so, but still, Karthik, every time I hear you, I hear new things and new, so I'm ready for our next Jugalbandi. So I thought what I'll do, Asad, is just break up my comments into 3 parts. One is just add perhaps to what Karthik has said about what did we know from before about the situation, about solutions that had been tried before. The second is, I think there has been I know we talk about learning loss, but I think as a system, as a society. I think there has been a lot of things that have been tried and hopefully learned. And the third is, what do we see as we go on ahead? My comments are all very India based. I don't know anything outside of India. So that's what I'll do. So in terms of where we were before March 2020, I think Karthik very, very, nicely put out the situation that there are three parts to this learning, 3 or 4 aspects to where children were with learning before. One is learning levels were very low, as he shows 3, 4 grade levels below. Now, when you're in 4th standard, you can't go below grade 1 levels. So it's hard to measure how low you could be. That is one. Second is vast variation within grades of where children are, making it very difficult for teachers to teach. And I would add 2 more, Karthik. One is that persistent. We have ASER data from 2005 onwards. Not only are the low levels persistent, something that Lant Pritchett calls big stuck. You're stuck in this big stuck. But in fact, in India, as a result, perhaps of many other things, we even see a decline. And this decline cannot be attributed to larger numbers of children coming into school, because we had very high enrollments even 10 years ago. And I think the 4th thing that I would say is, if I look across states in India, then you see, obviously huge variation across states and across the distribution and the composition of children in different grades. So if I take like a Himachal or a Kerala, we have almost say 50% children at the grade level, measured however you want to measure it. And then a whole bunch of children very close behind. So there is a distribution which is, not at grade level, but they're not very far away. Then you have states like UP or Rajasthan, where maybe only 10, 12% of children are at grade level and huge numbers are very far behind. And yet we have a system where the curriculum framework is the same, teacher trainings are the same. And so there is a whole one size fits all that is supposed to move this forward, largely dictated by a grade level linear progression of the curriculum. So that's where we were with our situation. Now, one of the things that, I was also thinking, there are going to be all these economists and whatnot. And I looked, Asad, you're at a business school, so I thought I should also bring out some data. But I think what we've done is, so we have the advantage of having ASER data every year for 10 years till 2015 and every other year thereafter. So we at least have something till 2018. So what I did was pull out, let's say, and I think if Shahab can help me, I have a few slides just to show this. They're not as elegant as Karthik's, but let's see what we can do. If you go to the next one, we put out to see before COVID, what was the year-on-year gain that children had. And this is Uttar Pradesh, which is one of our largest states with, big learning crisis. And don't worry too much about the, actual numbers in each cell. But basically each color is a cohort as it has moved through the years and as it has moved through the grades. And so if I just look at the percentage point improvement in a child's ability to read this very simple kind of text, you see that depending on which year, which cohort, which grade, you see anywhere in the younger grades at 5 to 10 percentage point increase year on year. A 5 to 10 percentage point increase in able to read very basic text is not a lot of gain, right? And you can see at the lower part of the table, the lower table, that gain is a little bit higher. So that was our usual situation. And so while there is a great deal of hand-wringing on learning loss, it's not like we were on a steep learning curve before. And we had not adequately handled the kinds of the dimensions of the learning crisis that Karthik has outlined and that I have added a little bit too. However, there were efforts, and we have been part of some of these efforts. There are other efforts in India as to how do you break out of this, right? And so what does the data tell you? And so what I've done is, in the next slide, pulled out some data from UP. UP is a big state, 120 or 130,000 primary schools run by their government. And remember that we saw this, let us say a 5 to 15 percentage points annual growth is what we've seen in UP for a long time. And then in 2018-19, for a brief golden moment, there was an opportunity, golden moment for us, that is, UP may have had lots of other golden moments. We had an opportunity to use this teaching at the right level that we've worked on for many years. And that was implemented just for a period of about 2.5 months. And you see with the graph on the right-hand side, that in that 2.5 months, it was actually possible to come up with a gain that was equal to your usual annual gain. Why was this able to happen? Because you were able to put several things made this possible. One is there was a momentary commitment to saying, let us see if all children can get up to a certain level. Now, what is the political, winds out there that made it happen? I won't get into it. I'm not a politician, but we seized the moment when we saw it. The second was that it was possible to put aside for a couple of hours a day the grade level curriculum. So teachers were very clear about the goal. The goal was basic reading, basic arithmetic. You were allowed by your own system to say you can put aside the grade level textbooks, group children by their level, do a simple ASER-like assessment, which looks at where do you start with the kids and how far can you go. And in a period of 60 days in UP, our largest system, you could move like this with the same teachers, same resources. Cost of this was literally 1,000 rupees per school. And this was for grades 1 to 5. And so the cost is really, nothing. So if I take my own data seriously, our own experiences seriously, I would add, Karthik, a massive silver, not a lining. I would say I would love a silver cloud to say that what this indicates to me, and we talk a lot about evidence-based decision making, but you've got to take this evidence, this government's own evidence, and say that whenever schools open, whenever that is, if you put aside your grade level curriculum, you assess children in a very simple way. And the assessment for this teaching at the right level is really a one-on-one. You sit with each kid and ask them to read the kinds of things that I just showed you. So it's a reconnection as well. It's a teacher getting to know, there's a lot of talk about socio-emotional skill. One of the things about all this other stuff is getting to know the kids and how they are coming back. And so I think just getting to know the kids, figuring out where they are at, and then setting realistic goals that give confidence both to the teacher, to the child, and to the parents to really say that if, we can come back and have, give a period. Why only 60 days? I've been using 100 days because for some reason governments or politicians like 100 days, but you can have a repeat of 100-day phase and another 100 phase just to build back the foundations, because if you go to the next slide, there is enough evidence from the government's own data. Again, doesn't matter what the numbers are, just look on the right-hand side. State after state, large numbers of children, short bursts have been able to create significant learning improvement. When this UP program was happening, we knew it was a short period, and there was a whole, I won't go into the details of how it was implemented, but there was about 5,000 UP government people above the level of the teacher who did a 1-month pilot. And in that 1-month pilot, or 20 days, we saw a 20 percentage point improvement in reading levels. And I remember a conversation with the senior officials, and I said, and I'll say it in Hindi and I'll repeat it in English, कि सर अगर 20 दिन में 20 percentage point improvement हो सकता है, तो 100 तक पहुंचने के लिए कितने दिन लगेंगे? And he said 100 days. Okay, so if 20 days, I can see 1 percentage point. Every day the child is making one step forward, done by your own people. How long will it take for me to get every child up to the reading level? And this gentleman I was talking to said 100 days. So I'm not even the 100 days is not even my words. I'm taking the words out of the mouth of people who've seen some of this happen. So I would say that if the government, if teachers and education system said, doesn't matter what the curriculum is, we'll return to all of that at some other time. Right now when schools open, let us just put all our energy in reconnecting with our kids, really meeting them at the level at which they come back. They may come back at all kinds of levels, because when they left, they were at all kinds of levels. But we have tried and tested methods of helping them catch up. I'm not saying they're going to do algebra and trigonometry, but they're all going to be able to read and do some basic arithmetic. We may even have a fighting chance of coming back much stronger than when we left off. But people have to take this seriously. And Asif, I'm looking to you to say, please ask me tough questions. Is this all rubbish, or can this really be done? Because I do believe honestly that this is possible, not in our lifetime, but in the next year, if we were to put our minds to it. So this is what we know from before. But I want to say a couple of things about what we've learned. We, meaning we, us, India, everybody else has learned. I think we've learned a whole bunch of things. And again, if I look at our Pratham experience, and maybe Asif, you will maybe relate to this as well, is that we have used this time not so much for learning, but not so much for learning in terms of what should children learn academically, but for learning what families and communities can do in assisting in this process, in feeling that they're part of this journey, as opposed to standing outside the school wall. And we have found in that currently, for example, in about 12,000 villages, we send out messages every day. And we've done this for a whole year, almost 350,000. Is that correct? 3.5 lakhs. What is that in thousands and all that? I can never remember. Messages go out, but it's not just messages. The message is just step one. Every household gets a phone call or a visit, depending on when it is possible to visit and when it is not possible, to discuss that when I sent you that activity, did you like it? Who did it? The message came on dad's phone. Who helped the kid? Where did the kid get stuck? And this is even on, these 160 character SMS messages. What we've learned, we've spent years doing teaching at the right level. I think we've spent the entire last year doing reaching at the right level. And where we find that when we send out messages which say, make a triangle, which is an isosceles triangle, and measure each side, there is much lower family engagement than if I say, how much water did the family use yesterday? If you were to count that in buckets, how many buckets did you use for washing, how much for cleaning? There's much greater family engagement in the second type of task, as opposed to the first type of, which is a very textbook related task. So that's one. I think we have not spent enough, and I agree with Karthik about his second silver lining. I think because parents had to do stuff, we see even parents who are not that educated, siblings have played a massive role in all of this, and neighbors. If you have interesting tasks, small bits and pieces, because we could not work on any online stuff, it had to be drips of interesting things. We've got massively good feedback. The content that we will go ahead with is so much stronger because we got this feedback on a regular basis from households. And so I would love every teacher in India pick up the phone and have what I call cool chats with 5 parents every day and with the children, and do it repeatedly, because you're going to build a connection, you're going to build a motivation, you're going to know what each family can do. And it may not go all the way to personalized learning, but it'll be a personal learning, which we really need at this time. And so we've seen that some of the old-fashioned methods, SMS, radio, and simple calling your aunt, the way you call your aunt, calling your children's parents, textbooks. Indian government was able to distribute textbooks around July, August last year in a big way. Textbooks are very familiar things. There is a pathway inside the textbook, even though I've just complained about the curriculum. But the textbook is something that even people who have not been to school that much can kind of engage with children. So, while very high-tech online learning is fine for, urban elite kinds of settings, I think that this low-tech and human touch, and when that low-tech lands on social structures that existed, there is much greater traction than just, sending it, kind of dropping it from the air. So to sort of just wrap up what I'm saying, I see as we head forward, 2 major challenges. I mean, there are 100 challenges, but I'm going to capture them in 2. One is there's going to be a whole bunch of children who are going to land in the middle of primary school who've never had any schooling or maybe any preschooling. The children who come to class 2 this year are going to come straight from their mother's lap into standard 2. Landing them with the standard 2 curriculum is going to kill them forever. You've got to prepare a whole chunk of children with all kinds of things we usually do in preschool, school readiness, cognitive activities, learning how to work in groups, expressing yourself, all kinds of things, which I think I would like to, you can call them school readiness, but get a whole bunch of kids to start school well. Many times in India, children come into first standard too early because parents are anxious, and they're thrust immediately into a very straitjacketed academic curriculum. This is our moment to open our doors and open our hearts and really welcome children into school. Invite mothers as well to say, we are going to set up the way we would really like to have a school readiness program and run it all the way, if necessary, to class 3 for 100 days, 200 days, so that everyone feels part of this journey and does a whole breadth of activities and not just, alphabets and numbers. And the second big challenge is catch up. We're going to need catch up. If you look at Karthik's slide, you're going to need catch up all the way up to 8th standard. Karthik's 8th standard kids had 7th and had 6th. This year's 8th grade kids are going to jump from primary school into 8th. You cannot kill them again by giving them, high level physics and whatnot. You've got to give them time to really catch up. So we have this readiness and catch up. And I guess what I'm saying is think of these as two massive chunks and not little steps of grades. Our new education policy, if we take it seriously, we have a tendency in India to really, worship our big books and not really look at them. We shouldn't do that. We should look at what the policy says. And the policy actually lays out stages. So take the stage seriously. The policy says foundational learning is really important. Take it seriously. Put aside this curriculum, which has been the part of the problem, and rethink the whole thing. But again, Karthik, I keep going back to what you're saying. Our mindset in this filtration and sorting has been completely structured by linear curriculum, exams, and centralized decision making. We are going to need local decision making. Should I open the school or not? Should I ask some kids to come in the morning, some kids in the afternoon? We have no practice of local decision making, but we're going to need it for all the administrative and the organizational stuff. And I think that if we are able to put aside this linear curriculum, examinations anyway, we don't really seriously examine our kids, while they're still in elementary school, put that aside and move into this. I want to do school readiness. I want to do catch up. I want to bring community members, homes who have helped so much in it, and bring them as part of this. I think you could have a terrific year. The other thing is, I don't know what we are waiting for. There is going to be schools turn on, schools turn off at short notice and with not much preparation. We've had a whole year to prepare for this. So I think we need to think, in addition to Karthik's, how do you manage the safety aspect of this? I think you need 3 scenarios. Sometime when there is nothing possible, you're in complete lockdown, you can't move. The only way you can reach each other is by phoning or by waving from each other's terrace. What shall we do in those situations? We know parents can do stuff, but they won't do your curriculum stuff. They will do interesting, engaging stuff. And so how do you do that? There will be limited movement possible when people can move around in the neighborhood, but children can't formally come to school. What can you do in neighborhoods, whether it's the teachers doing something or community volunteers? And then, of course, there's a period when schools will open. And what do you do in the first X number of months of that? We've got to have this plan because we can use this plan right now. And I think that what we've learned during the pandemic, home, community, school is a continuum. Strengthen this continuum. It's not a default just because schools were closed. We all know, every one of us is here on this webinar because that continuum helped us in our own education to get to here. Why should it not help with everyone? So just to conclude, I feel we are at a very important cusp in our practice and in our policy. Do we really want to go down the sorting route, in which case open the school, put the grade level curriculum, throw out everybody else, whether virtually or really, because that's going to be just getting back on the straight and narrow that you were. And then you will have, one Google head and one Goldman Sachs head who will be Indian, and we can feel very proud. Or if you really want to use this opportunity and use not just a lip service to equity, but really believe that learning for all can happen. And my data shows you learning for all can happen. Why should we not give it a fighting chance? Then give this year to catch up. Put aside, school systems are powerful. They have a lot of people, they have space, they have time, they have resources. This is the time to change the destiny of our countries. And that's why I say, seize the moment. COVID was a horrible thing, is a horrible thing, but we can come out of it much stronger if we change our goal and our mindset. So that's it.
Thank you, Rukmini. That was very fantastic about what the evidence are out there, large scale evidence showing that the teaching at the right level is the right thing to do. And we cannot go back after the pandemic because the gap is increasing. So we need to actually think about a program, probably crash program or the catch-up program that you were talking, to try to meet the gap, at least reduce the gap. So without further ado, I will now invite Asif Saleh.
Thank you, Asad. Going after Rukmini and Karthik is like probably the biggest anticlimactic thing. So I will try to stick to substance, but I think the passion was very evident. And Rukmini, can we have you in Bangladesh and look outside India for for a little bit as well. But I know you are looking outside India very much. I actually got referred to by so many times the teaching at the right level in various parts in Africa. So that's fantastic. I will give a much more grounded sort of understanding in terms of what is something that we are trying out in spite of all the doom and gloom, and what have we learned in this process. I mean, there obviously has been a lot of questions about school reopening. We have been wondering, so we never knew how long this was going to be lasting. But as we are now seeing that it's lasting much more longer than we anticipated. So I think we are kind of going back to drawing board like everybody else in terms of thinking around remediation plan. So let me just quickly go through, I have a few slides that I want to go through. Let's see. Okay. In terms of education impact, I mean, I think this goes without saying. I think a lot of things have been said, but just to lay out the facts that since March of 2020, last year, so schools have been closed, and about 40 million students, roughly, have been impacted, and that's about 1 million teachers on and off, and government's out of school education, which is meant to kind of bring in children who have dropped out. That's also severely disrupted. That hasn't started as well. So the dropout sort of net that was meant to catch more people, that has been left, and we are looking at more people, more students dropping out. So definitely, I mean, the crisis is magnified in different aspects. I mean, these are sheer numbers in terms of children who are at the risk of learning losses, and the learning losses. These are, I've kind of did an aggregate of various studies, including Braxton, the CAMPI, there's a coalition of group education practitioners, and also some studies from World Bank as well. So, in terms of the numbers, I mean, we are looking at 5.9 million school children who are at serious learning loss risks, right? So, some estimates show that at the primary level, this is almost like about 19% learning loss, and secondary level, it's almost how much higher than that. Now, what does that mean? I mean, what Rukmini mentioned, that, you know, if you're already at a lower level than pre-COVID into your learning level, and then you're coming back to school after getting auto-promoted and have very basic assessments and not much learning, then you can imagine how much the learning loss has been. So in terms of regular access to distance learning opportunities, the number has been also very poor when it comes to rural and urban slums. That's about 10%. So BRAC, as you know, has a very large educational footprint. So both in the formal schools and also running its own non-formal schools. So close to 1 million students have been impacted. So when the COVID started, immediate response from the government was moving to distance learning. So we kind of played our role to support them with the kind of creating the content for television, and also helping them move to sort of doing some of the online contents. But but the reality is, like, when we look at BRAC school children, I mean, which is mostly in remote areas, so only 56% of households had access to television, 37.6% households have access to internet, and 95% of households have access to feature mobile phone, but not necessarily having internet. Now, after a few months, this is a World Bank study, that the 69.5% students actually said that they didn't take part in distance learning classes, and 57.9% due to lack of necessary devices, and about 16% they just didn't like distance learning at all. So now, within that context, I just wanted to kind of give you a glimpse of like a typical BRAC school in different contexts. These are non-formal one-room schools where operated by one teacher with the same cohort for about 4 years, targeted towards 8 to 10-year children from remote and marginalized communities. So class size is approximately 25 to 30 students. So it's very, very low tech and low resourced. And in order to ensure scale and also ensure that infrastructure is not really available, right? So within this context, when we were thinking about what we can do, we had to think low tech, and we had to think community, and we had to think what we can do with what we had. So we focused around feature phone and community radio. So in the context of where there is not much internet available, so we piloted this notion of homeschools, right? So we tried it with grade 5 students. So currently we have about 1,200 homeschools that are in operation. The heart of the model, there are two things. I mean, one is that you have a feature mobile phone used by the teacher who uses the conference call facilities to call 4 students at a time and have these half-an-hour conversation and with them. But a lot of the learnings actually also happen in the clustered learning groups. So aimed at more self-learning, and also kind of supported and facilitated by the teacher's conversation, and also with the help of older educated people within the community. So this is how it looks. I mean, in terms of visual representation, that teachers connects with the CLG, what we call it, clustered learning group, who actually lives in close proximity, right? So our BRAC schools was very much within the community, because it's one room, it's easier to build, and so within that community, so we know that where the children actually lives, that within a small catchment area. So even within that, so 3 or 4 students who are living closely together, they are forming the learning groups, and assessments have been taking place via voice call, and worksheets that were hand delivered to them to their household. So essentially what it did was that this whole notion of kind of moving from the teacher-centered learning that we had, where a teacher was teaching to 25 kids, to more about student-centered learning. So students were the center. They're getting some support from their peers. They're getting some support from the community. They're getting some support from the family. And there is limited supervision and assessment from the teacher. So that all of that kind of formed the essence of this kind of blended model of these 2 learning approaches. Now, this is a picture, like the left picture is from a Rohingya refugee camp. So in the camps, it's again, the center point here is the feature phone that you see, and that's where a teacher has called, and they're all talking to the teacher. We had transition plan in terms of how we were gonna go into different sort of stages of reopening. But unfortunately, we are still at phase 1. We haven't moved to phase 2 as yet. And we kind of also catered how we are gonna use the social distancing in classrooms when we reopen, with low-tech solutions in terms of hand washing stations. Some of these were very much like homegrown and very, very low cost as well. So these were all in place, but we have not been able to open as yet. Now, we did some internal assessments for our homeschool model, and I think the numbers were very promising. I think first of all, the students continued some form of learning through this school. And again, it's not ideal, but based on this condition, where others were who were not kind of connected to the remote learning, and who were rather than being completely disconnected, this kind of filled some basic goals and helped them to be connected, right? And the flexible class scheduling based on students and parents' convenience ensured like higher attendance. We heard that also the students thought the classes were interactive, and almost 100% students actually submitted homeworks regularly, and health and safety related messages were beneficial, and more importantly, 100% students are very, very eager to come back to school. These were some of the weaknesses and strengths. I mean, obviously, some of these are known. Adequate interactions were not possible. Duration is not sufficient for critical subject. Availability of device network. Sometimes some families have just one phone. and they go away, and then they have to wait till they come back. So sometimes this has been an issue. Electricity charging has been an issue. Proper assessments were always not possible. And physically, it has been difficult for teachers as well. So to not kind of see the students and interact with them. Strengths have been that they were engaged in the learning process. Teachers have motivated students mentally during this crisis period. This is the undertold story of the school closure, which is that the mentally has been very, very difficult for the children. So just being some sense of normalcy with some sense of engagement, that actually helped them throughout this crisis period. And with COVID also kind of getting some sort of information, health information has helped them. And part of the syllabus could be covered. So that's where what Karthik was mentioning. My parents are always very concerned about syllabus covering. So that's whether you learn or not from the parents' perspective, that they were happy that the part of the syllabus were covered through this limited interaction. And then we tried this other thing where we had access to community radio. So there were 11 community radio stations across the country who kind of what we did with the feature phone, we also amplified getting going into community radio, which can be accessed through feature phone and also traditional radios, is this notion of within a limited coverage, targeting the pre-primary students. So helping them on basic language and communication, pre-maths, science, environment, health and safety. There have been 2 to 3 lessons per week, 20 minutes for each lessons, and lessons were replayed in the station to ensure maximum reach. So in 2020, we targeted about 51,000 students through this, about roughly 1/10 of BRAC students enrolled in primary, because we don't have community radio coverage everywhere across the country. So it covers about 14 districts out of 64. So that has, I mean, we did an independent study. This is also very promising for any sort of future pandemic learning as well, that the radio school were able to reach about 75% of its target audience, and more than half of them listen to the program very frequently, and 37% mentioned that they listen to it sometimes. 95% expressed that they were able to understand and converse used in the radio school. And I think the key thing has been that, again, during the closure, radio school have kept them mentally engaged and interested. And this was actually communicated, sort of complemented by also the teachers talking to the parents of our school children as well. So that engagement actually helped to complement what they were hearing in the radio school. From very subject-specific analysis of survey data, so in pre-math, and then sort of some of these other topics, I think the learning was pretty encouraging as well. So an assessment showed that at least 75% of the students correctly responded to the assessment questions. So now here, this is where we are now. I mean, I think students want to be back. We are seeing a lot of human chains and other things. But again, going back to what Rukmini was saying, the situation is same here. I think that there is that wait for that golden moment of when everything is going to be perfect, and then we will reopen the schools. But that is unlikely to happen. And again, I think this whole notion that students are actually staying home and staying protected while the schools are closed is absolute, actually not the reality, right? So while the schools are closed, students are out and about. So they were very much exposed. And the government here has said that they're not going to reopen schools unless the infection rate drops down below 5%. Now, again, here, the nuance is very important, and local level decision making, as Rukmini was saying, is very important because, there have been areas. I mean, last year, the majority of the country was below 5%, where Dhaka and Chittagong had the bulk of the sort of the infection. So if that was the reality, then schools could have been opened in those areas, and also closed when the infection rate goes up. Similarly, now there are areas where infection rate is below 5%, schools can be open, but this and in a very limited capacity, and government has plans for that, but somehow because of the central decision making and this whole notion of this idea that everything is going to be normal and then we're going to start school is really putting the students' future at risk. Now, what do we do when the schools are back? I think pretty much what Rukmini said, the similar things. We must reopen these schools gradually and absolutely sooner than later. And essentially, we are very worried about the girls coming back to school. I mean, we're worried about everybody coming back to school, but the toll that it had economically, I think this is having more of a, worse impact among women and girls rather than boys and men, obviously. So there are many reports of girls getting married off because of school closure, and so in terms of this, essentially the children dropping out due to economic reasons is another possibility that we are seeing when we are surveying our own children. But here, I think the role of incentives, financial incentives, is going to be very crucial. So students, and particularly girls, to bring them back, there are some incentives for secondary school. The incentive needs to be higher from the government side, which is going to help the families both financially and also essentially create an additional incentive for them to be back to school. And of course, the large scale campaign would be needed, again, to ensure that they are coming back quickly. And last but not the least, just to look at some opportunities. I think we have had a lot of interesting learning during this phase. And I think one particular one is around technology. I mean, obviously, there is opportunity to bring in technology in classroom and education administration, but I mean, it has to be gradual and thoughtful and practical, right? So we have trial by fire, but we have also learned through this process that there is huge inequity when it comes to digital infrastructure, and this absolutely has to be prioritized. That affordable, meaningful internet connection is almost a basic human right now. So, and then last. Couple of things essentially is that remediation plan, as Rukmini mentioned, that I think that has to be the front and center, that very targeted, focused, additional hours, teachers training. I mean, I think I spoke to teachers a couple of months ago in Chittagong, and they're very eager to come back. They're very worried, but they're also like, give us some training, give us some targeted syllabus that we can cram in terms of a short amount of time so that they can come back. Make up some of the losses very quickly. So there is leadership needed there as well. And I think we want to build back better. I absolutely wholeheartedly support Rukmini's call. This is the opportunity to get things right, but it needs to be rightly balanced with the right investment in capacity, technology literacy, infrastructure, better assessment, and essentially giving more autonomy to students. And I will add local decision making after hearing Rukmini as well. Thank you. That's it from my side. Let me stop this sharing.
Thank you, Asif, for giving some of the promising solutions in the hard to reach communities, especially thinking about feature phone, low-tech solutions, this kind of thing, or radio, community radios, which seems to be promising. So there are also seems to be some evidence out there already that what can potentially work to mitigate the learning loss. Rukmini mentioned some things that we need to pay attention to, the things that the learning loss is growing up, and so that means we cannot really go back to where we were. We need to actually build better. So with this, we have a lot of questions, and I see Karthik has responded many questions. Thanks, Karthik, for helping to do this. So I will start now the questions from the audiences, and let me just first think about all the questions to you. So what we have seen is that a lot of schools are private schools, like funded by the local bodies in many countries, including in India and Bangladesh. And some of these schools might not open at all, because we are talking about going back to school. But if the schools are not open, what are we going to do? So if I can start with maybe Rukmini.
So Asad, in India, we are seeing that especially the low-cost local private schools have been under a lot of pressure, because the parents, schools are closed, so parents don't give the fees, so they can't keep their teachers and so on. Now, private schools who have more resources or part of a network have been figuring out how to survive. But I think we are going to see an increase in government school enrollment. Already, for example, in a few states in India, we have seen in Punjab, who is also where the government has made a very big and a public effort. I think you can see that coming in. So in some sense, I think that, the low-cost private school is a reaction to what maybe was not happening in the government sector. And again, I think that one way to assure access, let's say that I'm concerned about children and not so much about education providers, I think one way of ensuring access is to really do a very public, as Asif says, a big campaign to bring everyone back. Now, the private school teachers, again, local village private school teachers are often not paid very much either. And I think that I have never understood, I don't understand many things, Karthik, you can explain it to me. We have this, this employment guarantee schemes, the Manrega program in India. Why at this crisis moment should Narega not include instruction for children? So anybody who is a community level instructor, why do they have to only go and dig, for water bodies? Why can we not invest for a period of time? This could be as a disaster relief or whatever. Allow community-based people who want to teach work off whatever is an agreed upon framework. That would also provide a good relief to the private school instructors who I'm sure are not employed. And it would also enable the school to see in a structured way who are the people in the community who from time to time can be part of our instructional community. So again, I think
what a brilliant idea. No, I mean, have you suggested this to anyone? I mean, this seems absolutely brilliant.
Well, I'm saying all these things. Who is listening is not clear. At least I can see the three of you listening. But I'm saying that if you allowed, again, local decision making, suddenly out of the blue, how is everybody going to become a local decision maker? Mm-hmm. But if you allow our panchayats and say this is a sum of money to be used only for bringing children back to school and for the catch up, and allow them to use it in a way, I mean, what at most we will just lose more money. I mean, we've done that before. So I think there are ways in which this public-private divide, particularly in some part, I mean, in India, rural India, in some states, 50% children go to these kinds of schools. And therefore, we have to really worry about them. They are not just private schools we don't need to worry about. How do we ensure access? And how do we beef up instructional capability? And I think these are some ways to do it. So Karthik, whoever you're talking to, please tell them 6 months Narega and allow community level instructors to, help.
Yeah, so this raises a question to Karthik actually. So in terms of the gap between evidence that we academics generate and the policy, and you have a lot of interaction with the policy makers. Given the evidence that we are seeing, both from Brack's findings, from Pratham's findings, and these are the largest NGOs working in the field. And what are the gaps that why the policymakers, the government in particular, are not actually utilizing this evidence that much? What is the gap?
No, I mean, I think I could give like an entire symposium on that. I think, see, there are many answers, right? I think the first is that the typical policymaker is just under so much firefighting nonstop, right? I mean, if you sit in the office of one of these, of any of these secretaries, right? So the sheer number of things they're dealing with between logistical challenges and teacher unions and different, issues, that the time to really think and be consistent in what they do, look at evidence is often limited. Now, that's why we have policy frameworks. The policy frameworks are supposed to look at the evidence and do this. Now, the NEP is actually relative to previous documents, a remarkably good document, right? So I think when you think about policy, the process of evidence to policy shouldn't be, okay, here is a study, let's act on it. It should be that every time there is a body of evidence, we try to modify the policy directions that way, and NEP does try to do that. I think it was just particularly unfortunate that the NEP got released and taken up at a time when schools were shut. So it was almost kind of, ironic that we were trying to reset aspects of the education policy at a time when schools were actually shut. So I think I've written about the NEP before, and the NEP for the most part, I think is a sensible document. I think the bigger challenge in places like India is that, we write beautiful policy documents, right? I mean, the challenge is that the implementation capacity and basic state capacity is so weak that often the best written plans and policies are not implementable. So, we've now got studies of large-scale interventions that find exactly zero effect, even though they look so good on paper. And that's because the system can only do what it can measure and monitor. So it's easy to see school construction. It's easy to see appointing teachers. It's easy to see distribution of textbooks. It's easy to see construction of toilets. But it's much, much harder to see teaching and learning. And it's much harder to see whether, children are learning, which is why I think what Asar and Pratham have done over the past 15 years has been among the most important, teaching at the right level, and their interventions have obviously been important. But the larger bringing the learning crisis to the public consciousness, even today, it happens only one day a year, or now once in 2 years, when the ASER report comes out. And for the most part, it just doesn't occupy that same kind of policy salience. So it's a very complex problem. And, I think the best we can do is keep on reiterating the research. The people who are constantly in the education community, who are not necessarily the policymakers, but are still engaged on an ongoing basis, the large nonprofits, the multilaterals, as long as people keep on repeating the message, then over time you hope that some of this will stick. But it's a hard process.
Okay, so thanks, Karthik. And my question now to Asif is about, it's a kind of related thing that we saw your interview in The Guardian, actually the UK foreign aid card to many countries in GEOS, and particularly BRAC is affected through this card. And also BRAC also invest a lot in education, girls education in the disadvantaged community, and non-formal education wise, BRAC is, in Bangladesh, I cannot imagine without BRAC actually. So what are the things BRAC are planning to do to address this the gap that will be coming because of this card in aid?
This is I guess I think we have to use all of our ingenuity and innovation and dig deep to get through this. Because this crisis also means that their needs are going to be far higher, right? So at a time when we have to do a lot more, we have this other crisis that we have a lot less to work with in terms of resources. So I think that is continuously. I think going forward, not just for BRAC, for other nonprofits as well. This continues to be a big battle, and I wish my probably 90% of my time actually I spend on just trying to fundraise and talking to funders and other areas, which shouldn't be the case, but that's essentially the case. But I think what do? We from BRAC's perspective, we have some flexibility, obviously, that we have our own resources in terms of the money we generate from our social enterprises and our microfinance operations that we can actually use. But again, the large-scale funding that is often needed to subsidize and also to pay for some of these costs is going to be more and more will come at a high cost, or will not be there. That's for sure. So what we need to do essentially is that we need to work better in terms of with the government and change the systems, and rather than trying to come up with a parallel model. I think that's for sure. So what we are trying to do is that we are trying to be very choosy in terms of where we work and where we start to kind of focus our interventions. And that is dictated by more in terms of needs. So we are kind of reducing our sort of geographical reach into more poverty pockets, very hard to reach areas, rather than blanket national operations. So for blanket operations, we only have our microfinance and also our health program because of COVID. But other ones, we are kind of reducing the spread. And the second thing is that, increasingly trying to work with systems changes. For example, this remediation plan, we have already created the remediation plan for primary schools. And then we're working with the government to see that if they incorporate that into theirs. And also in the bringing back children to the school, again, liaising with the government and the state is very, very important. But again, I think this is also a new type of ways of working. That's one. And then the second thing is also looking at technology as a whole. Again, I said that we need to be thoughtful about it, but technology also and other forms like, we talked about radios, we talked about social media. We're looking at those mediums in terms of rather than having more barefoot people-based approach, that we can disseminate some of those things through these other forms. I mean, the country has changed quite dramatically. I mean, our people's ability, the way they consume information, that is dramatically changing as well. So we are looking at all of these things in terms of A, where we work, B, how we work, C, what we do as well. So I think all three areas are changing. So there is some short-term impact in terms of reducing scale, but mid-term and long-term, we are also going back to the drawing board to redefine some of these things. Thank you.
Okay, it seems that the interaction and collaboration with the government will be very useful in future, probably. And government, especially as I understand and know in Bangladesh, lack capacity, and there we can actually fill the gap probably from the NGO sectors, especially the NGOs like BRAC and Pratham, in terms of their influence in educational achievement of these marginalized children. So my question to Rukmini, so it's a little bit different. We have all talked about any assessment in terms of the cognitive outcomes, and this crisis also means that students are not really interacting in the social settings, especially in the school classroom settings, where a lot of social interactions happen, a lot of other skills develop, and especially the thing that we call soft skills. And it seems that the pandemic is not going away very soon. So, and a generation of children are going to miss the interaction, social skills, and development. What we can do in the next couple of years, looking like the vaccine is not going to be that widely available to open up fully. So in the meantime, is there something that we can think of developing this kind of interactions among the students, children?
So, in a part of our regular work, even before COVID, we as Pratham, when we work directly with communities, we would do some activity in the school alongside with the school teachers. But afternoons and after school, we've spent quite a bit of time in our last couple of years in forming children's groups. And I'm sure in BRAC, they must be doing that as well. So for the younger age group, we have mothers group. And for the, let's say 8 or 9 years old and older, we have these children's groups. And that is partly because we felt that the children need to learn how to work together. Our school system, in addition to being exam driven and curriculum driven and so on, really puts a big focus on individual excellence. So if you're not excellent, you're already sitting in the back of the class. And then, as an individual who's kind of struggling, it's a very difficult situation. And we also know from everything we know about children, all of us, that actually children can do school is the only place where you have to be individual and excellent. Everywhere else, the value is on how cooperative and collaborative and persuasive you can be. So actually, we in school, we don't learn any of these things. We just learn to say me, 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 ami, and I'm coming first. That is what we learn in school. So our children's groups were also, we realized that the school, depending on the state in India, is a big place. Whereas your own pada, your own mohalla, your own hamlet is a much smaller place. And, whoever you play with is really your social group. So we've been doing these children's groups, 4 or 5 children, where we had resources, we have shared devices. So you have a tab, but it doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to 2 groups by design. So you have to figure out between the 2 groups who has it when, who charges it, who keeps it safe. And we found that it actually works very well. When we had tablets which were a part of the school, they were not used as much. They were left in the cupboard and everybody was very worried about, accounting for its security. You gave it to children's groups. We've had hardly any loss, and hardly occasionally you have, people who've been very keen on charging it, and you have that kind of a loss. So our children's groups do activities together, small projects, performance. I mean, we all have done it as children. It was just not called children's groups. It was just called your friends. But putting a little bit of structure on that. And during the COVID time, actually, it is these groups that really were at the forefront of being able to penetrate into the hamlet and into the community. We see the same thing with children, with mothers groups. If I look at the mothers of children who are aged 4 to 8 today versus 10 years ago, is a vast difference. Universalization of elementary education has led to young mothers being much more, at least having primary education. So they have a much more wherewithal. And I think there's a huge national resource called young mothers who have to be brought into this. So I think children have learned a lot of social emotional skills in the time that the schools have been closed. Some of it a very tough way. They've seen families really struggle. So when schools open, rather than assessment, I think we should have time in which children can draw, children can act, children can have different ways of expressing themselves, because these things may not just come out just like that. I think you have to have a platform of listening, of being able to, relate to each other and do things in groups. So yesterday I was on some webinar and people said, put socio-emotional skills in the curriculum. Well, that's the best way to kill anything, is to put it into the curriculum. I mean, how much social-emotional skill are you supposed to have at class 8 versus at class 3? I mean, really. So
yeah, in fact,
platforms of doing things together.
Yeah, I just want to come and say something that, Rukmini, when she mentioned about making the content, the isosceles triangle example you gave, right, versus measuring the buckets of water. There's a very nice recent paper that Abhijit Banerjee and Alejandro Ghanimian and colleagues did in, I think, in Calcutta or Delhi. It's called the market math study, right? And so what they did was they basically did this very simple study where they found street children who were actually selling things, when your car stops at the traffic light, and the child would be selling something for 22 rupees and they would give him 100 rupees and he would make the change, and he would give the change of 78 rupees, right? But if you take the same child and ask him to do 100 minus 22, he has no idea how to do this in a formal way. But the functional knowledge of the math is there because he's able to make the change, right? So that's the point about kind of the market math, or the practical knowledge versus kind of the formal representation of that knowledge. So while we talk a lot about learning loss, and I think we're all very worried about kind of basic literacy numeracy, I think there is also, like Rukmini was saying, an element whereby putting the content in the curriculum kills the joy out of it, right? Like, relative to actually being able to learn. So I think Asif was also saying this very nicely, right? That moving from this teacher-centric model to a student-centric model where the student then absorbs information from all the sources around. I think, that was a wonderful example to see. And, maybe Asif, I'm sure every part of the world could use Rukmini, but I'm sure India could also use some of your models because, I think some of just this thoughtful, community-based engage. So the radio thing you were doing, I thought was excellent. we actually have evidence from RCTs from Jamaica from 1980s that radio-based instruction is actually incredibly effective and low cost in a way of kind of getting content out and engagement. And so, what seems great about an entity like BRAC is through a combination of practice and evidence and research, you're coming up with these rapidly innovated models. And I think, going back to what Rukmini was saying, one of the things which I had been seeing in India, which I'm just very worried about, is that there is this over-centralization in every way, right? I mean, which is in the first wave of the pandemic, the state governments were looking to the central government for leadership. Then the central government said, okay, states figure out education. But a state is still almost too high a level at which to kind of figure some of these things out. And I think we need a lot more distributed, decentralized decision-making with some principles on safety and some content, but with a lot more operational autonomy, given at the field level.
Okay, good. We are now over time, actually, and I think it seems that there are some promising ideas, solutions that we have. And especially the models that BRAC has been doing in Bangladesh in terms of the low-tech solutions. The Pratham's thing that teaching at the right level and building up a catch-up camp or something like that, so that students can actually reduce the gap. These are all promising solutions. We want to be optimistic for the future. And with this note, let's bring this to conclusion for this webinar. Thank you all very much. It's very, very important event for us, considering the learning gap is an important issue that is emerging. And we thank you for your contribution. And thanks all for participating for joining us today. Thank you.